I'd like to propose we'll hear from Tim, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll hear from Anthony, and Bert will be guest d'assistance. Yeah. It's a pleasure to meet. I think I met Tim Brown briefly at WAIS 2001. Let me get back here. I believe I met Tim. I saw his name on the program, but I don't really recall speaking with Tim. So I'm so glad that he has come here. And I want to promote a wonderful book that I read this year, Diplomarine, which is the first installment of Tim's memoirs. He has an incredible life. I will not do it justice, but I could give just a brief. He literally lied about his age to join the Marine Corps, which I didn't know you could do that in our modern era.
Your mother to lie.
Sounds like something from the Civil War era, not from the 1950s. He lied about his age. You joined the Corps at 16, correct?
Yes.
Yes. And grew up dirt poor, if I may say so. The book tells us that, and had an extraordinary number of adventures in virtually every country you can imagine. He was a Marine for many years and then became a diplomat. And both of his careers have been extraordinary. Of the two memoirs I've read, that I can think of, two memoirs this year, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass and Diplomarine by Timothy Brown, and they both impressed me very much. So you're in great company. You were not an American slave at any time, but anyway, so Tim will now be telling us a little bit about his book, and you have copies available, correct?
Yeah, I have copies available. They're in the trunk of the car.
Okay, here's Tim.
Okay. And I brought along my slave labor to change the...
That peon.
Absolutely.
There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it used to be like way back when, providing I can get a click on this sucker. Anyhow, General Sullivan is actually vouching for my Marine experiences without realizing all the oddball things I did while I was in the Marine Corps. But I got three good conduct medals, so I never got caught. Okay. Anyhow, it's loading. Okay. Actually, what I would also like to do very much so is say thank you very much, John, to putting this together. This is the second WAIS I've spoken at. Spoke one with Professor Hilton. This, to me, I have a lot of fun with you gentlemen and ladies with your little notes. And we got into an argument about the speed limits on Highway 395, as I recall. This is my logo, and it's on the front of the book along with. I was in Nicaragua, my first overseas assignment, and lowering the flag. The flag on your left, which how many of you recognize? Okay, this is the flag of a Consul General of the United States of America, which is a permanent rank. Going from buck private to 3-star equivalent wasn't really what I had planned on doing. This is the cover of the book. If you can figure out which one of those Marines is me, it's right there. Way back when, I'm both younger and a lot skinnier. I hope you got that one. Like the other way.
I'm going to get good at this. Hang on.
You say off you want. No. Next. Okay, this is, to give you an idea, it's a really big world out there, and I have not been everywhere, as you can very tell. But these are the different places where I did serve one time or another. A lot of it, you will see Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, Washington, D.C., which was my worst post. Some ways, in other ways, it was the best. South America. I was, for a couple of years, deputy director, actually, of U.S. economic political relations with Western Europe, particularly. I was doing NATO, European Community, International Energy Agency. We probably have a few things we could talk about in that. And I must say, I have to thank Uncle Sam because he paid almost all the way around, and we had the children and we hauled them around with us all over the place. And they came out fairly well as well, as you could probably tell. I have changed. This was my photo to my beloved bride. I was 20, she was 18. We both had to have our mother's permission before we get married. This was in Nicaragua. It was the second time I make sergeant. That's another story. You go to Reno, Nevada. This house is still there. It's been built up all around it, but this is where I lived when I went to high school. Two major differences. Somebody's actually planted green around it. This was the ladder I used to get up to the attic room, which was mine. This was the outhouse. It was a two-holer. That's no longer there, but the house is. How many people recognize anybody here? This, of course, is Augusto Sandino. These are two officers of his staff. This gentleman was later the head of a clandestine network supporting the Nicaraguan Contras. I haven't interviewed him. I'll get into that in another book. And here's, anybody recognize him or her? How many of you recognize him?
FDR.
No, oh, that's FDR, yeah. This is Tacho Somoza, the president of Nicaragua on an official visit in 1939 to Washington. Tacho was assassinated 6 weeks before I got to Nicaragua on my first visit. His son was assassinated in Paraguay while I was on the Paraguay desk at the State Department. Interesting coincidence. Here we are. Innovate, simplify, do or die, general. Okay, this is the Marine Corps Ball in Managua. Myself and my bride. The gunny was unfortunately killed in an automobile accident about 2 weeks later. And at the age of 20, I wound up being the NCOIC, the Marine Security Guard, at the embassy in Managua. But I lived.
Again, one thing you might tell people about the Marine Corps birthday in a foreign country, the Marines hold it on November 10th, and the big deal is to try to get an invitation to it because they're limited. So they invite people from all the different embassies, and of course the Marines aren't allowed to be married, and of course guess who they invite? So it's
You're
a
telling
big
our
deal.
secrets. Yeah. And it's always a delight to enjoy the Marine. Well, incidentally, the youngest Marine receives a piece of cake, and he always gives it to his lady. And I'm sorry to say, I got it when I was 16. They thought I was 17. In Managua, it worked again. And a couple of posts in the diplomatic service, I was the oldest Marine. So there we be. This gentleman, and this is going to be a surprise to some people, was a Comintern agent. At least that's what he told me on his film. He is the gentleman who, in fact, helped Che Guevara learn guerrilla warfare. He has never been heard of. This is the only photograph so far ever published of him. He is a Nicaraguan. I couldn't publish this until he passed away, which he did. He was a real gentleman, but very, very quiet. He died in poverty in Mexico City, barely making it. I used to go visit him when I could in Mexico. And this is me, in case you can't tell. While in the Marine Corps second enlistment, I actually did a certain number of civilian dress missions in the northeastern part of Thailand, particularly, and also in the Philippines. In this case, these were counterinsurgency operations, and I was going in and trying to pick up on the attitude in the rice villages because the Pathet were also running patrols through the area. So I would. This is General Orman Simpson. He was the commander of the 3rd Brigade when I went in as his interpreter in Thai, ambassador, and this is me. So I was stationed in Hawaii. We were living in Hawaii. Tamara was born in Hawaii, and I would go in and out for 2 or 3 months. And on occasion, I had to take my books with me because I was simultaneously going to University of Hawaii. And my professors, once they realized I was serious, they couldn't believe it. With the exception of a math course I flunked, would give me the opportunity to just take an exam when you get back, and here's the syllabus if you can't be here. Please try to show up for class, but if not, we won't ask you where you were. The reason I stayed whenever possible in a Buddhist temple was because it was considered inviolate. Came pretty close a couple times, but nobody, the PLs, Puppet Law, would not come into the village temple. So I stayed until he left. Then, I frankly, towards the end of my Marine career, I took the Foreign Service Officer examinations both. I had to fly in from Thailand to take the oral in Washington. Passed it, but I didn't have a university degree yet. So they recommended that if I could, with a wife and 4 kids, afford it, go back to college and try to get the BA. I worked as a waiter in Sparks Nugget, if you know the Reno area, and lived in this house, which is still there as well, although this has been completely built up. And my wife, I told her, look, we have to get this thing fixed up. So I give her $100. She was expecting, she painted it, and she furnished it. Don't ask me how she did it, but we took the same furniture with us to Tel Aviv at the government, State Department's expense. So this is what I did. This is the way I did it.
Question.
Sure.
The picture of you with Bill Solheim, what was your connection with the anthropologist?
I was the interpreter with one of his archaeological expeditions. He was also one of my university professors because it was in the University of Hawaii. And Chet Gorman, who was with him, was one of his graduate students who went on himself to be a very good archaeologist, although he had some problems, passed away young. Bill passed away, I think, last year. So, yeah. He was living in the Philippines last I heard, on one of the out islands. We all begin to grow older. The hair changes. The grin doesn't, although it probably should have. This, we're going from here, this is now the diplomatic side of what was going on. Here is the young lady who is running things here. Yeah, we're standing in front of our house in Herzliya Patuach in Israel. And this is our oldest daughter. Our youngest son, who is now Consul General of the United States in Monterrey, Mexico. So he's done better than I did. This is Tamara, and this is Rebecca, who is a disabled American Marine veteran. And of course, this is us, I hope. I still had hair, that's right. I forgot about that. Go. And this is one of my better friends. In Israel, Hallelujah came in to see me once and became sort of a spokesman for the beatniks in Tel Aviv. Part of my job was to take care of Americans who had problems. And he would come in, and we had nice chats. It turns out, I hate to say this, he claimed he was a university professor at an Ivy League university at one point and said hell with it and went to live in the beach in Tel Aviv. He gave me this picture as I was leaving as a souvenir. I had a problem with him because he was living with another American young lady who was a stripper in a nearby bar. And I said, you say you're a prophet. How can you be a prophet, a man of God, and still living with a stripper? Because God sent me to this world to help the sinners, and she's the biggest sinner I know. And foreign service officers spend a lot more time in combat areas than most realize. As a matter of fact, sorry, General, I spent more time in war zones as a diplomat than I did as a Marine. At this point, this is probably why we lost the Vietnam War, but they were sending in foreign service officers trying to take over the Civil Operations Revolutionary Development because it's not really, fighting an insurgency, in my view, is not really a military job. It's a civilian job. You have to have guns, but if that's all you have, you never win. So there I am with one of my bodyguards carrying the pack for the radio, calling a artillery fire into a Viet Cong unit that was up in the mountains not too far away. And just to get an idea, these things tend to be international. This was given to me by Ferman Cienfuegos, commander of the military that fought up on the Martí Liberation Front in El Salvador, is a very good friend of mine now, after the Cold War. And he gave me this, among others. At the time I was in Vietnam, there were Salvadoran guerrillas being trained in Spanish in Hanoi by the North Vietnamese. I'm skipping a bunch of countries, but later on in Paraguay, and this was discussed earlier, I would go to the palace because at that time I was doing simultaneous English-Spanish. And once the president realized that, he would call up the embassy and ask me if I could go down, as long as it wasn't sensitive, and I'd go down and work as his interpreter. One of them involved in the book, it was a emissary from the United States government trying to get a particularly grubby drug trafficker who was in jail in Paraguay. He refused to give him because he was more scared of his cavalry general than he was of us, I think. This reached me in El Salvador, much to my surprise and much pleasure. But this is where I found out his native language was Guarani Indian, not Spanish. This is not going to be easy to read, but this is a cable I wrote while I was deputy for Cuban Affairs in the State Department. There's my name. It's been declassified. And basically what we were doing under the law, it's not up to a diplomat to make policy. It's their job to implement it and to make advice as to what we think is right or wrong. But once the boss makes the decision, you follow the order. In this particular case, we were threatening those of you who know Mexico to name Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, as a foreign agent, which would have meant no United States entity or individual would have been able to have anything to do with them, not even buy a tank of gasoline, without committing a federal felony. That was what the law was. They had sense enough to jump back out of it.
Tim,
Sir.
who was it addressed to?
Pardon?
Who was it addressed to?
Well, this particular one was addressed to the foreign ministry, but they were to inform Pemex. And matter of fact, that's how I got to know Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. That's another issue.
This one, right?
Yeah, there we go. And this is not the nastiest one I wrote, but this is the first one I declassified. So if I give an idea of the way it works, if nothing else. The embargo makes it illegal and a felony for a person to have an unlicensed relationship. You can get a license. I used to sign the license all the time. That's how I know how much we were exporting to them. I signed them more than you think. We were always one of the rules was always, if it is of interest, health, or personal well-being, and it can't be obtained as quickly elsewhere as it can in the United States, we always approved the export. And it was perfectly legal. And do you recognize anybody in this? They have grown up.
Older too.
And this is the older sister. One of the things I always did was stay in touch with my congressional group. And Barbara was named as Miss Nevada Cherry Blossom Princess while we were in Washington. Next post was in Martinique, which is France. Most Americans don't realize that there are more French NATO troops south of Florida than there are American troops south of Florida. They have 3 regiments. We have this Puerto Rico National Guard, which is good. And as a former Marine, this is the daughter who was disabled and laid on holding their 2 children at the time, the third on the way, and the band. One of the real problems I had is my driver flew the flag upside down, and he sent troops to protect the consulate because that's a distress call. But and here's the other one. This is in Camp Lejeune, where she voluntarily was getting ready to go to the Persian Gulf. She got hit by anthrax and a couple of things, but she's disabled now. And this is a guy who put me on an assassination list. If you haven't ever been on an assassination list, it's kind of fun. It's interesting. You know, the French police would show up in an armored car and treat me like the ham in a sandwich, take me around until things settle down. There's a long story behind that. I won't go into it. And one of the French regiments is the 3rd French Foreign Legion, which is stationed in South America, has been for decades, because the Europeans launched their missiles and their satellites from Kourou, which is a better location than we have in Florida. So they made me a son of the regiment. This is the next book, and I may change a few times, but I was in Honduras. I had been doing, Cuba and some other things. I got to know some of the young folks out in the White House, Ollie North and these sorts of folks. And I got a telephone call because they knew I had Marine experience, I had Latin America, I had Central America, I spoke the language, and Reagan had gone to Congress secretly, obtained $100 million for the Contras right in the middle of the Iran-Contra imbroglio in the American public. But the requirement was that the Secretary of State take personal responsibility that there be no more Iran-Contras. And they created an office in Washington. I went into Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and spent 4 years managing that. This is, you're going to get a lot of ideas broken. This gentleman here, who I believe has passed away now, but he was a Sandinista field commander, had a run-in with he's not a Marxist, had run-in with the Marxists in Havana, wound up in prison there, got out, and some Argentine officers and an American agent, I don't know what he was, might have been from, came in and took him to Washington during the Carter presidency and asked him to be command of the new Contra Army. They were not called Contras at that time. These are an example, and I did my doctorate on the Contras, so I picked up a lot of photography and that sort of thing. This is the 1980s, before Reagan was, again, inaugurated. And here are volunteers up the mountains. I won't go into all of that here, but just give you a feel. So it had started as a volunteer resistance movement, the Sandinista Front. The only force, I think the general read this, 6% of the Contra's frontline infantry combat in units, mixed gender units, were women. This young lady, I have her story by her commanding officer, who was killed about 2 days later in action. I don't know what happened to this one. During the Battle of Bokai, which is a point at which, well, I was recommended for it along with my officer for a citation. These Contras got hit by 8 battalions of Sandinista Special Forces, counterinsurgency and so forth. And because I was the only American officer allowed on the field, it was considered too dangerous for the CIA or others. I went in, I took this picture while I was there, because the press was claiming there was nothing going on in Honduras when in fact they were there. So I had to go in, I took photographs with a couple of other people. She was headed for the front. He was throwing in everything he had into the front to stop the Sandinistas. carrying her baby and her weapon. And they also had women who had succeeded in passing the Guatemalan Army Ranger School. These are 3 of about 5 who were in their ranks. I was doing the spot reporting. The general will understand that's probably about every 2 hours at the maximum. I was sending in cables that were getting to DIA, CIA, White House, and this is the battle map I was maintaining. I'm Foreign Service, but I had some experience with this in the Marine Corps. I was also a graduate of the Army Intelligence School.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Who is who?
Okay. This is the border between the 2 countries. This is the headquarters for the Sandinista units in Nicaragua. There's a story there that I will tell them. This is the rear guard of the resistance, and you see they're pushed right up against the border with the four battalions of counterinsurgency, Blix
Are
and
those
Blaze.
Contras or are those?
These are Sandinista.
Oh, okay.
And the real public relations question in terms of the press, Sandinistas were saying, we're not in, it's false, we never would dream of going across the Honduran border. They had 4 battalions in here.
How much is a battalion?
In their case, they're relatively small. It's usually, if I remember correctly, and I'll have to be corrected, between 400 and 500 troops. And they were on both sides, sweeping. This was their headquarters. If I have the time, I'll tell a quick story. I was standing out at Sotocano Air Base in Honduras, briefing a congressional group that had come down to look at the situation. And we had already received clearances for 2 operations against the Sandinistas, not by us, by others. And I was drowned out by jet fighters taking off. Had to stop, then I went back, and after they stopped, because they came back, took about 15 minutes, and the Hondurans launched a flight. The general would appreciate this launch flight. There were 8 aircraft that went in to bomb the Sandinista positions. That was, don't bomb outside our boundaries, bomb the ones that are in our boundaries. The trouble was they didn't recognize this river from that river, and so instead they bombed right here and scared the hell out of the Sandinistas and the journalists who were with them, and they pulled out. President sent in a regiment of the 82nd Airborne American to support the Honduran action. Yes, this is all Foreign Service. This is the recommendation that I received along with my office for the National Human Intelligence Award for the reporting on the Battle of Okai. As far as I know, I'm the only non-CIA officer ever to have been recommended for it, at least up to that point. I won't try to read this, but it'll be in the book. And this is not a very good picture, but this was the commanding general of, he was a former Guardia Colonel, Enrique Bermudez. I was sitting after Honduras in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in my office when I found out he'd been assassinated in Guatemala. These, just one of a number of things were brought out by defectors. This was brought out by the defecting Chief of Staff of General Ortega in the Nicaraguans, and Bill Ratliff actually wrote a book about it. To give you an idea of how they were loaded for bear, we're looking at inventories for almost 400,000 AK-47s, 40 plus Makarovs, and about 3 million rounds of ammunition for an army that had about 30,000 men.
Where are these coming from?
Actually, it breaks it down further. They're coming from East Bloc, primarily. It was Soviet Union at the time. Remember, we're still Cold War. A lot of it was coming out of Czechoslovakia. Some was coming out of Poland. There was some Chinese.
You sent 400,000 guns to an army of 30,000 people?
Well, you share them with your friends in in El Salvador, and in Honduras, and in Guatemala, and any place else they'll take them out.
How much of this was donated?
Pardon?
So how much of this was donated and how much of it was paid for? Do you have any sense of that?
If you can figure out who paid for it and who donated whatever in half the places in the world, I wouldn't know. We have some of the financials, and the Soviet Union basically was supporting it.
Yeah.
And Cuba was the pipeline. And when the Sandinista revolution started, the cover story was put out that they were being supported by the Venezuelans. In fact, the arms were being flown in from Cuba. And we have the manifest of the aircraft and everything that were done by the Costa Rican, who were the ones that allowed the guns through before the Sandinista. And then after they took over, the stuff would come in much more directly and much more easily. And largely for the work with the Contras, I in fact never personally met the president, but his aide made sure I got this saying thank you. And here are a couple more people. Recognize any of them? John McCain, Chris Dodd. He was on the Contra side, he was on the Sandinista side. Here's the president of Honduras, commanding general of the Honduran army, and I'm in the middle because the Hondurans were hosting us as we were supporting the Contras. Actually, they were, never mind, I'll get into that. So, and that's me at one of the Contra camps, a 14.5 machine gun. They used, incidentally, we bought, well, I don't know who bought, but the United States provided Soviet weapons to the Contras as well, so that they could use captured ammunition. And this is a very good friend of mine, believe it or not. Harry Reid, he's an old family friend, known him for a long time. After the war was over, they were trying to disenfranchise about 40% of the population up in the mountains. The Contras got a hold of me. I wrote an article in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal. And the senator agreed to lend his name. He did not support the program, but he did support free elections. And his support flipped the entire bureaucracy in Washington, got us enough money to get them registered so at least they could vote. As a result, the Sandinistas lost the election. Now, any of the Cuba hands here recognize this young lady? During my time with the Contras, 4 years, she was the top analyst in the Defense Intelligence Agency and actually probably the most influential intelligence officer in terms of Nicaragua and Cuba in Washington at the time. So the CIA director gave her a special commendation just before she was arrested and tried and convicted of treason. She's serving 25 years. So I have to work that into the narrative of my next book. How did it influence, insofar as I know? She's Puerto Rican, that died in the whole pro-Castro. And she had a right to her views. What she didn't have a right to do would be stealing classified files and sending them to Cubans. Then we all grew old. So, this will be the third one, because what happened after I did my doctorate, I said, you know, there are usually two sides to a war. What does the other side think about this? And I went out looking for communists, not the way I did before, the way I did after I was a civilian. This young gentleman was actually my wife's next door neighbor in Costa Rica before we were married. He later went on to be trained and educated in Lumumba and Moscow, trained in Cuba and North. About a year and a half total, they prepared him to be an officer in the field. He was the director of the Sandinista movement. When they took over, the ones that are now in charge, he went back home to relax, and they sent an assassination squad after him because they didn't want to share power. They didn't get him. But while he was in North Korea, this was his book that was given to him in graduation from the North Vietnamese Spanish language training course for Latin American guerrillas. This is another one. I mentioned him before, Ferman Cienfuegos. His real name was Eduardo Sancho. He is the first cousin of Plutarco, Costa Rican born, not El Salvador, Salvadoran born. And he was nice enough to give me this. Yeah, he gave it to me. Okay. This gentleman was, and still is, he's extremely active in politics in Mexico. He's very close to Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. They were neighbors when they were young. Second generation Marxist-Leninist who still thinks Stalin got a bad deep break. I stay with him when I'm in Mexico City, and we have interesting conversations. But he was trained by Noel Guerrero. He also, incidentally, for those who are lovers of Che, and I agree with this analysis, if it hadn't been for Che and being the worst government sort of guerrilla commander around, he didn't know what he was doing. He got himself killed in Bolivia. Those who have been into it, if you're going to operate in secret and try to organize it, it's not a good idea to have your radio antenna right next to your tent and make sure your house is near a pharmacy so you can send your assistant out to buy medicines and use it as a place for internationalists to go on revolutionary tourism trips, because the movement of that many people into a secret area, nothing at all secret. And I think Fidel probably helped by making sure that the radio was on and they talked 2 or 3 hours a day. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty about that. This is a mural on his front wall, which I tried to get for the Hoover Institution. I couldn't get anybody to pay for it. But it's much larger than this, but it's sort of a full wall mural. His home was the Sandinistas' principal safe house in Mexico City, and he was their primary contact with the Soviet KGB and with Cuban intelligence at the time. This, if you recognize Humberto Ortega, is a letter that he wrote to the gentleman I showed you before, giving him some instructions, which ticked him off because he didn't know he worked for Humberto. This is in the Hoover archives, incidentally. And here I am with Pepe Puente, my buddy. What happened at this time, and the way I got into this Noel Guerrero business, was Pepe Puente was at his home. His father was a very senior member of the Communist Party. Received a telephone call from Lázaro Cárdenas, the former president, and then received a telephone call from the head of the Communist Labor Unions in Mexico, both of them saying, we have an extremely important comrade in jail. We'll get him out. He got picked up by immigration, for what it's worth. He's in the immigration jail. Just make sure he has, fruit and something to write and something until we can get him out of jail. So Pepe at that time had just graduated from high school, and his dad sent him down to support them in effect, make sure they got what they wanted right next door. And when he first went in, he talked to Noel Guerrero, Santiago. What they find is that, okay, we'll get you out. But Noel says at the end, oh, by the way, there's some guys down in the same jail. I'm not sure who they are, but they may be comrades. Check them out. And it was Fidel, Raul, and the boys, about 17 of them all together in an immigration jail. They were later released. And Pepe becomes Fidel Castro's guide while they're preparing for the revolution. That's the prison, which is now a warehouse. This is how you collect up money. I'll go very quickly. I asked the Faribundo Martí how they paid for it, how much it cost. I was told it was about $185 million, and at that time they got some of it from ransom, some of it from robbing banks, and some of it from these two are obviously ransom, and some of it from just scaring the hell out of people with things like Molotov cocktails. And there were an international solidarity movements. This happens to be the membership card of a young lady who was in San Francisco at the time, who was part of the Sandinista front support system here. And they were going around the world. Fidel was with, this gentleman was the head of a clandestine sabotage cell in Ensenada, Mexico. Their target was the Hoover Dam. If, in case of a war, they were a sleeper cell. He's actually a Nicaraguan who was with Pepe Puente and Che. And this is instructions to their personnel in Washington. This is instruction on how to contact Chinese intelligence officers in Geneva and Mexico City. This is all. There is a gentleman you may recognize despite the scratching. They were close contact with Saddam Hussein. And some of them were living their good life all over the place. And it really didn't matter. These are my grandkids. This is what they think about my work. Okay? It's in our backyard. Okay.
Question or two. Why don't we? Tim has copies of his book, correct?
Yeah, I'll have to bring them in. I don't know where you
Can I run and bring them in, or someone? Let me do that while you talk. So we'll
Machi. Machi.
First I want to
Machi. Get it?
And a big aplauso for Tamara being around.
First, I want to say I'm very impressed with the fact of your career, especially the part where you, as a Marine, got 3 good conduct medals, which is sort of unheard of.
Oh, okay.
No, okay, you went to the PX and bought them, right? You didn't get them.
No, but I may have to bite the next one.
Well, no,
Nobody believes it.
Having been in about the same time you were, and a few dust-ups with Marines on occasion, I had it hard to believe. But you mentioned this thing with Che, and that I've heard that rumor about being set up by his own people in a certain sense.
It's hard to, you can't really say with absolute certainty what the intention is of another person.
Yeah, but wasn't he also, and I'm just going from memory on this, didn't he also slaughter a bunch of people on a train in Bolivia just before this or something?
You hear a lot of these things. It's difficult to say. I don't blame him for that. The only thing I blame him for is being incompetent.
Well, yeah, but.
And the consequences of that were a lot of people dead, whether it was just one train or a bunch of other.
Oh, no, I understand that.
Yeah. That particular end?
I think another thing about China, Bolivia is that he alienated the Communist Party in Bolivia. And some of their agents were also passing it.
That was after he had been to Africa, after he'd been a couple other places he went back.
But it was in Bolivia.
Yeah, Che's family was on the political side, yeah. Yeah. Well, Elizabeth Burgos de Bre, who wrote the book on Rigoberta Menchú, who won a Nobel Peace Prize, found out that she was lying to her. Also wrote a book called Pereira Ramírez Alarcón or Comandante Benigno. And Benigno was the deputy of Che in Bolivia. He defected to France, and there she wrote the book for him. So that's an interesting one to look at. It's not in English, only in Spanish. So anyhow, I think I got out of the works. Sent my daughter to bring the books back in. So if there are no other questions, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you can sort of expand on this notion that a lot of people have, that wars are created to make money, ultimately. What do you say to that? How much truth is it?
I don't know if they're created to make money or you can make money once they get started.
Okay.
It's hard to say, but they're certainly run by elites of one sort or another. And there's nobody, I've never met any group that went to war for the purpose of becoming poor. So.
Okay.
Well, remember, power attracts money, and power also corrupts. I've known enough of the former Marxist revolutionaries who were frontline, and I don't deal with the ones who got into some of the things. But they're honorable people. They did what they believed. I disagree with their beliefs. We have interesting conversations. But it's Cold War history, basically, and one of the things that really bothers me is that I don't think we've learned from it very well, and if we're not careful, we're sliding into Cold War II. Different players, different ideology, but same concepts. Anyhow. I don't
How
know.
about up front?
Oh, okay.
Or-
Good heavens.
I think that'd be best to keep
It's
to
not one
sit here.